And since the day I took this office, I have authorized U.S. forces to attack terrorists abroad precisely because I know how real the danger is.
After 15 years of war in the Middle East, what is the legacy of the U.S. war on terrorism? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. "15 years, more than 1 million dead and almost $2 trillion later. What is the legacy of the U.S. war on terrorism? The invasion of Afghanistan in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks was followed by the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Major victories like the capture of Osama bin Laden came alongside crushing defeats. Despite promises to pull out of the region, U.S. troops still remain in both countries. Let's get more now from CCTV's Jim Spellman, who joins us from our newsroom. And Jim, the country is reeling. We've just seen another attack at a nightclub in Florida, killing almost 50 people. How do homegrown attacks like this change the U.S. strategy in this global war on terrorism?
It's really a tidal wave of a shift within how people respond to this. So-called lone wolf attacks, where a single terrorist or sometimes a pair of terrorists plot attacks, extremely difficult for authorities to identify and break up. In the past, intelligence agencies have sometimes been able to intercept communications between plotters or follow terrorist financing, use that information to foil attacks. Knowing this, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and other groups have encouraged supporters around the world to not attempt to contact them, to simply launch an attack of any sort. Use a gun, use a knife, use a car, anything at your hands. They provide information on building bombs for anyone attempting a more ambitious attack, but without the information stream between terrorists, much harder for authorities to detect these plots. It's a profound change in tactics that authorities in the U.S. and Europe are struggling to keep up with, and Western governments have been ineffective in countering the online propaganda that has so effectively recruited these lone wolves.
So what is the status of the U.S. war on terrorism right now?
Yeah, so the war on terror is a phrase first used by U.S. President George W. Bush, as you mentioned, in the days after the attacks on September 11, 2001. This all-encompassing approach led to the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Critics said this was a misguided approach, that it was unwise to target a tactic instead of specific enemies, that it led to over 1 million civilian deaths, cost billions of dollars with little to show. In 2013, President Barack Obama stopped using that phrase. Obviously, those efforts continue, though. The tactics are changing. Current administration relies much more on things like drones, small tactical strikes on the battlefield, broad electronic surveillance to pursue terrorist cells away from the battlefield, Anand.
Right, and Jim, what impact does the U.S. invasion still have on Afghanistan and on Iraq?
Well, the U.S. forces killed Taliban leader Mullah Omar, but the Taliban remains a force in Afghanistan, seems to constantly be fluctuating in power. U.S. forces, as you mentioned, killed Osama bin Laden, and Al-Qaeda has been greatly weakened over the years, but the group's affiliate in Iraq morphed into the Islamic State and has taken over large parts of that country and Syria. This has led President Obama to gradually increase troop levels there while trying to avoid another large-scale U.S. ground war in the region. Clearly, the next U.S. president will inherit a complicated set of challenges no matter what he or she chooses to call the fight.
Okay, Jim, thanks a lot. That's CCTV's Jim Spellman reporting. Well, joining me now is Andrew Fife. Andrew is an Iraq war veteran and Morland Perkins Fellow in Philosophy at the University of Maryland. From Vancouver, Tim Tuccaro is a professor of health science at Simon Fraser University. With me in the studio, Peter Kuznick is a history professor at American University and co-author of The Untold History of the United States. From Pittsburgh, we're joined by Colin Clark. He's a political scientist with the RAND Corporation. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Peter, let me start with you. Let's look at the big picture here, the broad stroke. The war on terror was launched by the Bush administration in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. It was a war that didn't seem to have a definition at the time, but how has it changed the United States, and how has it changed the way the world looks at the United States?
Well, the world looked at the United States very critically before the invasion of Iraq. You have to remember, on the eve of the invasion, there was a poll of Europeans, and 84% of Europeans said the United States posed the greatest threat to world peace. 8% said Iraq posed the greatest threat to world peace. So there's already a lot of skepticism about the U.S. role in the world. The U.S. position has not really changed. A survey in 2013 by Gallup, an international survey, found that still the overwhelming majority of people across the globe think that the United States poses the major threat to world peace. So the U.S. position in the world has not changed, and the U.S. militarism seems to still be the response. The fallback position in the United States is to look for a military solution to problems that don't have any obvious military solution.
Right. And when you hear things like that, when you hear about so much skepticism about the invasion of Iraq, you're a veteran of the Iraq. You went there, you fought there. It was a long war, a costly war in terms of lives lost, both civilian and military, and of course in terms of the money that was spent on it as well. When you look back on that, what did the war achieve?
I think the war, it took Saddam Hussein out of power, but unfortunately, or not unfortunately, but there were no weapons of mass destruction, so we did not end the program in Iraq that we went over there to stop. What did it achieve? Well, 2/3 of that country right now are fairly stable. The northern Kurdistan region, the southern Shiite region, Baghdad. So we've got 2/3 of a country, but the other half is this no man's land, this breeding ground for terrorism that's with terrible suffering and inspiring attacks here in the homeland. So I think that the invasion took a country which was stable for the most part, not the greatest ruler. Maybe there was the opportunity to do something good for that country, but ultimately what's resulted is a mixed bag.
Because that 2/3 of the country that you talk about, that's still under the control of the Baghdad central government.
That's right.
Still experiences a lot of violence.
Still experiences a lot of violence, but I think the level of violence is ratcheted down quite severely from just a couple of years ago. I think that the country is on the upswing, at least that part. I think it's the western region of Iraq and the Syrian civil war that's the real negative drawback that we're dealing with continuing today.
Okay, let's go to Tim Tuccaro in Vancouver. Tim, you completed the body report with Physicians for Social Responsibility. Tell us about this report. What did it cover, and what kind of information did you gather?
Our approach is to look at the public health impacts of war. And so we're looking at civilian casualties primarily. We do also count military casualties, of course, but the civilian casualties are much greater and tend to be ignored. So we were looking to document the over 1 million civilian deaths in Iraq between 2003 and 2011. And we did that with a house-to-house survey covering the entire country.
Colin, this war has spawned all kinds of terminology. We hear the term that this is an asymmetric war. These are not two armies on a battlefield facing each other. And I'm wondering, can there ever be a winner and a loser in a war like this? Will there be a point when the United States can, put the flag up and say, we have prevailed, this is a war that we've won?
No, I don't think so, and I think that goes back to some of the comments earlier about the misnomer of what the global war on terrorism is. It's a mistake to declare a war on a tactic. During World War II, the Allies didn't declare a war on blitzkrieg, they declared war on the Axis powers, and so it's misleading first and foremost, but that's part and parcel of what we like to do in the United States, is declare a war on things. We like to declare war on poverty, on drugs, on crime. But seemingly what it leads to is a war without end and without definition, which is troubling.
Peter, what is the primary purpose of a war?
If I could just add.
Go ahead, yeah. Go ahead, Tim.
If I could just add that this war on terror, as is phrased, was really fueled by the invasion of Iraq. As was pointed out, this country was stable and was really quite prosperous, actually, certainly in medicine and health. Before the first Bush invasion, they were doing very, very well. So I would say, in the United States, has perpetrated this war themselves by destabilizing the region. And of course, there are many factors involved, but one of them is this tremendous vacuum of power that was created by the U.S. invasion.
And Peter, when the United States...
I don't think that Iraq was a stable country. I mean, we like to look back. Saddam was supporting Palestinian suicide bombers. He was persecuting the Kurds and the Shia. So let's be reasonable about how, quote-unquote, stable Iraq was.
Peter,
it was prosperous.
Okay, when we talk about U.S. foreign policy, we hear that, you know, the primary aim of foreign policy is to safeguard U.S. interests around the world. What does that mean, and how is the military used to do that?
Well, Iraq's a good example.
Yeah.
Question is, whose interests are we safeguarding?
Yeah.
I mean, who was pushing for the invasion of Iraq? There was a group around Wolfowitz, and the neocons, even before George W. Bush took office, in 1997, they formed the Project for a New American Century, and their initial demand was for an invasion of Iraq and the overthrow, regime change of Saddam Hussein. The Clinton administration signed on to that program, and in the last years of the 1990s, the U.S. policy, according to the United Nations, led to the deaths of 500,000 children. Madison about that when she was Secretary of State, and she said it was worth the cost of 500,000 children. But and she also talked more broadly about policy. We use force is because we're the United States of America. We're the indispensable nation. We stand taller, we see farther into the future than other nations. So we justify this. So Iraq wasn't an absence. It was part of a long, thought-out strategy of people who then come in with the Bush administration and enact that policy. You know, to them, Afghanistan was a distraction. They wanted to get Afghanistan out of the way as quickly as possible so we could invade Iraq, which was their real goal.
But why? To what end? To what extent was the alleged presence of WMD?
To establish U.S. Hegemony, right? These people were after U.S. hegemony. Iraq, in particular, was because of the oil, the second largest oil reserves in the world. When Alan Greenspan commented on this, the head of the Federal Reserve, he said it's unfortunate that Americans can't admit that the reason we went into Iraq was because of its oil. But it was part of a broader hegemonic strategy in which Iraq was a centerpiece. You know, we were talking at that point about invading 7 different countries, right? And so, you know, Syria was going to be Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Sudan, Somalia. I mean, they went through the whole list. And that was the vision that they had. If things had gone away according to the plan, then that's what they would have done. We've effectively done that anyway, but it was part of a broader vision of American domination. Charles Kraut in 2002 wrote, he called this the unipolar moment. So this is America's unipolar moment. A few years later, he was saying that America's unipolar moment was going to last for 30 or 40 years. Then he dials it back and says, oh, hell, it's over in 2006. Because the policy failed, not because they didn't want to carry it out.
So, Andrew, that was then, you know, the United States considering invading 7 countries, as Peter points out. What is it like now? What has it changed to now? What is the war on terror now?
Well, we've definitely pulled back on, we're not crossing borders and toppling governments. Now we've got 4,000 or so troops in Iraq, 9,000 or so troops in Afghanistan, mostly in a supporting role, incidentally coming into combat, just in the sense that if you send trainers for firefighters and a fire breaks out, the trainers will help. But the war on terror has, I mean, I wouldn't even call it a war at this point, right? The Bush administration had a completely different vision. The war on terror was an excuse to turn Afghanistan into this experiment of dropping 250,000 troops in the middle of the Middle East and going country to country trying to remake that region. That seems to be over. Now it's targeted strikes against terror networks, SWAT teams, special forces operators dropping in to take out.
Because there again, the question arises, and as you point out, targeted strikes. Look, we just had the leader of the Afghan Taliban was killed in a drone strike, Mullah Mansour. He was replaced the next week. So, what's the point?
I think that's a good question. I don't know how to what extent we're really disrupting and destroying these networks, right? As long as you have these large ungoverned regions, these wild lands where these organizations can hide in the, or just actually not hide, right, can prosper in these ungoverned regions, it's not clear how terrorism ends, how these organizations will end.
Right, and Tim, to what extent or is the American public involved in this debate about this war on terror? Are Americans getting the full picture of what is going on? You know, we know that in many instances the Pentagon has worked vigorously to prevent pictures of this war being transmitted around the world. In a sense, are the American people being denied the opportunity to have their voice heard in this war?
Yeah, I think that's correct. A lot of polling information suggests that the number of casualties that Americans think happened in Iraq is about a tenth of the... And I think in that sense of being duped about the full impact of war, Americans have been duped by their leaders over the past several decades in Iraq in particular, but also in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and Syria, although the dynamic there is different. So I think it's very difficult for the American people to really understand what the impact of our military policy overseas is. And that's a real disservice, both on the part of the media, but also, of course, on the controllers of information. The Pentagon is famous for saying, we don't count civilian deaths. That is the cold reality that they are trying to promote, and really distorts the picture of the full impact of the wars.
All right, and Colin, if the intention of the war on terror was to reduce the threat, reduce the risk, reduce the danger, has that worked? Because if we look at Iraq, let's use Iraq as an example, we now have Islamic State, which is, as Andrew pointed out, occupied a third of that country. They occupy a considerable chunk of Syria as well. Would there have been an Islamic State if the United States had not invaded Iraq?
It's hard to say. I mean, certainly the invasion was something that led to the creation of al-Qaeda in Iraq, so ISIL's predecessor. But I wouldn't say that we can connect ISIL's resurgence all the way back to 2003. I think there are two primary factors we've got to examine. One being the sectarian nature of the Abadi government and the marginalization of Iraqi Sunnis by the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad. The other, clearly, is the Syrian civil war and the security vacuum that has opened there and has given ISIL space to set up headquarters in a place like Raqqa.
When you talk about the sectarian nature of Iraq right now, was it a failure on the part of the United States to recognize what kind of backlash there would be from that Sunni minority, which ran the country for a very long time, in the wake of the invasion?
I mean, certainly de-Baathification in retrospect was a pretty disastrous policy. I'm not sure how much we can keep blaming on the United States for the continued ineptitude of the Iraqi government. I mean, at what point does it become the responsibility of the host nation to govern itself and its own territory and its own people?
Peter, who determines U.S. foreign policy? Is it the State Department, the Pentagon, or is it all centralized in the White House?
Well, the White House has a very big say in foreign policy, and that's the disappointment about the Obama administration.
And the reason I ask that question is because if we look at what is going on in the Middle East right now, and we look at the U.S. role in that, and we look at the U.S. influence in that, some of the smartest people work at the State Department. Did they get it wrong?
Yeah, they sure got it wrong. I mean, it was Colin Powell who went before the United Nations and gave the speech that he said was the low point of his career. Right. It's an embarrassment. He went up there, the speech they wanted him to give, it was even worse than the one he finally delivered. But it was a pack of lies. And Colin Powell should have known better. Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, is the main proponent of the invasion of Libya. Look how that has turned out. So the State Department's got a lot of smart people, but smart people can screw things up as well as dumb people. I mean, it's not just the Bush administration and their ignorance and stupidity, don't know the difference between Shiites and Sunnis, when they invade, but it's also the smart people, and it's part of the hubris, and it's part of a worldview. Hillary Clinton is as smart as they come, but her worldview is very militaristic, and she still looks to military solutions to problems that don't have military solutions. And that's a mistake that the United States has been making throughout the Cold War.
She is one of the leading candidates to become president in this country.
Yes, she very likely will be the next president of the United States.
So do you think that is going to continue? That she would...
I think she's doubling down on many of the wrong policies, which is why Bob Kagan and other leading neocons have endorsed her, because she's much more in line. Trump, of course, is, what can we say about Donald Trump? He's totally erratic, and and says one thing one day and the opposite the next day. But on his good days, he sometimes gets things right. And then he'll contradict it the next day. So, of course, you don't want his finger on the nuclear button. Hillary is not likely to involve us in a nuclear war, but she is an interventionist, and she does look first to military solutions to these problems. I mean, I can't find a war that Hillary Clinton doesn't like. She's the old Goldwater girl. She got us involved, or she didn't get us involved. She supported the invasion of Vietnam.
Okay.
I mean, and all the recent ones.
Right, let me get Colin's response on that. Colin, is it going to be more of the same?
It's tough to say. I'm not in the business of forecasting. I'm certainly not going to venture to forecast the next president, and then from there venture what the next president's foreign policy would be.
Andrew, there was a recent poll done by the Pew organization which tells us that more than half of those polled, these were Americans who were polled, believe that military force is the greatest weapon in the war on terror. Now, you're a guy, you've walked the walk, okay?
That's true. And, you know, growing up watching action films, watching the hero run across the open expanse, being shot at by the enemy, bullets pinging around, all of them missing, and then the hero turning around and then taking out everyone who was firing at him with absolute precision. You know, it seems really unrealistic until I've lived it, right? The American military is this amazingly lethal and capable military force. Qua a military, you're not going to find a better military, and we are amazing in a firefight. But nation building, I mean, if we were to go into Syria right now, we would be in the same situation as we were in Iraq. We have this utterly devastated country that we would have to rebuild. We'd have to, with no police force, right? How does the U.S. military police a country where it doesn't speak the language, it doesn't know the culture? So I think where the U.S. military has work to do and has learned a lot of hard lessons over the last decade is how to occupy and rebuild a country. And I think that that's probably the biggest falling that leads to the failures in these wars.
Right, and Tim, if
I would add, though, that prevention is the best medicine in this. And if we can avoid creating a situation like we did in Iraq and creating the problem and the Sunni on Shiite violence that the vacuum created, we can go a long way in making a better world. Colin Powell also said, you break it, you buy it. We have got to take responsibility for war prevention as well as the history of war that we have lived so far. Prevention is the best medicine.
And Tim, I want to stay with you for one other point, and this also concerns U.S. public opinion. Is there something called war fatigue in the United States right now? We know, for instance, that President Obama is very reluctant to get involved in any major way in the Syrian civil war. We remember that when he announced that famous or infamous red line and then didn't go there. So now the United States administration relies on things like special forces, small numbers of soldiers that go into these countries. They rely on drones. Is that because the American people have just said, we've had enough of war?
Well, I hope it is. The Iraq war was a complete disaster, particularly for those who were touched by it personally. But our status abroad was devastated. Winning back the trust of people after large strategic mistakes like that is a very difficult prospect. So whether it's war fatigue or people beginning to see what the reality of war is for the civilian population, for those who are asked to fight in the wars and come home devastated. These are hopefully getting through to the American people. I'm not holding my breath, but I am hopeful.
Right, and Colin, if we look ahead to how this war is going to be handled, what the future administration is going to do. Let's take, for instance, the United States' relationship with Saudi Arabia. Now, the U.S. tells us very often that it acts in its own interests. However unpalatable that relationship might be, it is an ally in the United States. Is it time now for the United States to get tough with an ally like Saudi Arabia and say, listen, that you are financing a lot of these terror groups? It needs to stop.
Well, I think that's something that the U.S. has been doing for quite some time, that has been putting pressure on the government in Riyadh, on the Kuwaitis, on the Qataris, and others, that wherever they've seen evidence that these governments or individuals loosely connected to the governments have been financing terrorism. So certainly that's part of it. I think part of what the Obama administration intended, especially in its second term, was to pivot to Asia, was to move away from the Middle East altogether. But here we are once again stuck in this seemingly endless quagmire where we can't quite extract the United States and the military from that region because it's too geostrategically important. And so there we are. I don't expect the next administration, whoever it is, to withdraw wholesale just because it is so important.
Peter, I just want to get back to something that our reporter talked about right at the beginning of the show, and that is this new threat, which is the homegrown terrorist. How does that change the war on terrorism?
How have homegrown terrorists? I think that the war on terrorism has increased the threat of homegrown terrorists. I mean, it looks to the world as if the United States is fighting a war against Islam. I mean, that's not what the policy is supposed to be, but we've been overthrowing and invading secular Islamic country after secular Islamic country. We've bombed, what, in recent years, 7 Islamic countries.
Well, Andrew Basovich, who's a former military man, has actually written a piece in which he says that
the Taliban were not secular in Afghanistan.
Well, he said we bombed or invaded or occupied 14 countries.
14, but that goes back.
Yeah.
Basovich's piece goes back several years, and it says we've invaded, bombed, or occupied 14 different Islamic countries. To the world, we look at the Times Square bomber.
Right.
Do you remember when he was asked by the judge how you could detonate a bomb or consider detonating a bomb that was going to kill innocent women and children? And he said, well, what do you think America's drones do in Pakistan? He says they're killing innocent women and children in Pakistan. And so in the mindset of certain people, they equate what the United States is doing with what they're doing here, and they think it's a justification. Of course it's not, and there are a lot of, but if you go back to the earlier periods, secular response and a political response to U.S. foreign policy. Now a lot of that has turned into this kind of religious fanaticism, which is in many ways much more dangerous and less constructive.
Right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us. You guys.